Hello, hello, hello. How's everybody doing today? It's good to see you. Thanks for showing up to the broadcast here on Tuesday morning. Hope you're doing well. Just checking in. Amber, good morning to you. Madison, good morning to you. I see Donnie Hans in the house. Fantastic. So I guess you didn't make it here yesterday for the live broadcast, Donnie, but congratulations for finishing a close second on this week's Kahoot quiz. We did have a winner's pedestal, and you were number 2 on the podium, so congratulations. And Madison Gregitis is checking in here by phone. Hi, Madison G. Good to see you, too. So I've got both Madisons, Madison F. and Madison G, as well as Amber, Donnie. And who knows, we might even have KB Kenny coming in at some point. How you folks doing today? Are any of you having a quarter-life crisis yet? How many of you are stuck trying to figure out what in the world life is all about now? What's your life? Who are you? What do you want to be? What's most important in your life? Anybody having questions like that right now? I'll let you contemplate that question right now. So here's the deal. Today's lecture, we're going to be talking about 2 very classic theories of developmental psychology. We're going to be talking about Jean Piaget's theory of cognitive development and Erik Erikson's theory of personality development. Now, if you remember yesterday, I suggested to you that developmental psychologists are interested in how we change in 3 broad domains: biological, cognitive, and socio-emotional. And what I'm trying to do in this particular course is to give you an appreciation of each of these 3 domains. So yesterday we talked an awful lot about neurological development, right? We talked about myelination, dendritic blooming, and pruning, and we talked about using milestones to evaluate biological development in infants. That's cool. Now today we're going to talk about Jean Piaget's framework of cognitive development, which is provided, while it's not as popular as it used to be, it provides a great framework for thinking about how the mind evolves as we move from infancy to adulthood. And then we're going to talk a little bit about Erik Erikson. And Erik Erikson has a theory of personality development. And as I suggested yesterday, it's very popular in nursing schools. And really, it's a good way to know what kinds of things are important to the person you're dealing with at that given time as a nurse. What are going to be the psychological needs of an 18-year-old as opposed to a 35-year-old as opposed to a 45-year-old? It's a good way of organizing your thinking about patients. Right, Ken just popped in and said good morning. Good morning to you, Ken. You all should have just got a link I sent around about the quarter-life crisis. KB and I are just a little bit older, so we're in the middle of what you might call a midlife crisis. But yes, KB, apparently there is a new identity crisis now called the quarter-life crisis. So unfortunately, our millennial friends are floating about just as lost as you and I are in middle age. Good morning, Erica. It's good to see you too. She's checking in by phone, and she's also having a quarter-life crisis, right? I think we're all in crisis, and that's the cool point of Erikson's theory. So without further ado, let's jump right into this, okay? So Jean Piaget, old psychologist, started his work in the 1920s. He wound up dying in 1980, so he's going to be one of the earliest major figures in psychology. And he was a biologist in interest who became a psychologist and started working in the first IQ labs and became very interested in the mistakes that children made. Not necessarily the things they got right, but the patterns in the mistakes. And he began to ask the questions about where mental ability comes from, how it develops, and how an infant goes from knowing absolutely nothing to being the brilliant, intellectual, abstract people that I see right here in front of me. All right? And so he argued that our mind is going to evolve through 4 broad stages of intellectual development. All right? He argued that infants from the first 2 years of life are going to be in a presymbolic stage. Let me see. Wait a minute. Yeah. All right. So let's go ahead and talk. So he argued that our mind evolved into these 4 broad stages. So what he argued was that infants are born with a set of reflex. We talked about that yesterday, and they don't really know much about the world. So he argues in this first stage of premotor development, the infant is just learning how their body interacts with the world. So an infant starts off with a reflex, a sucking reflex, right? And that they suck the mom's breast, and that's a reflex that leads to a great reward. The child accidentally sticks their thumb or another object in their mouth, and they realize that sucking other objects can be interesting. So a child, in a sense, develops these schemes based on reflexes and begins to see that they can move their body around and interact with the world, right? And so children are sort of learning how their body interacts with the world. If you've ever been to a toy store, you'll notice that toys for infants tend to be ones in which they make sounds, push buttons, cause lights to go on and off, and make things move back and forth. This is because children at this age are learning how their body interacts with the world. Now, what he found was that children during this age are actually presymbolic. What do you mean by presymbolic, Chris? Well, symbolic means that you know that one object represents another object. He argues that children at this age aren't symbolic. What's an example of symbolism? Well, being able to use a language, knowing that the word dog stands for a big furry thing, or that the 3 letters DOG stands for the big furry thing, or even a more simpler ability, if I show you a picture, knowing that is the same as that big furry thing right in front of you. So children don't really have this symbolic ability. How did he know this? Well, it turns out that children before the age of 2 aren't very good at 2 very simple symbolic abilities. Children before the age of 2, if you stand them in front of a mirror and point at the person in the mirror, young children won't understand that they are actually looking at themselves. They don't have what we call objective self-awareness. All right? And more importantly, your book talks about this thing called object permanence. Children also don't seem to understand that objects exist even if they're not viewable. So right now I know that my car still exists because I saw it earlier this morning. It's in my mind. But children at this age, if you take an object that they're looking at and throw a blanket over it, it's almost like they forget that the object was ever there. If you go to your course resources folder, I've actually got a video where they demonstrate a 9-month-old children and his inability to understand object permanence. They've got a little toy that the kid's playing with. They take it from him, throw a blanket right over it, and then the kid starts looking around as if the object never existed, and he starts looking for other things. It's really an interesting phenomenon. Now, he argues that after this age, children then move into a second stage of cognitive development we might call the pre-operational stage. Now, after about the age of 2, children develop what we might call symbolic ability. They're pretty good at recognizing themselves in a mirror. They understand object permanence, and children have language ability. And that, if you will, is sort of the primary demonstration of symbolic ability. And so around the age of 2, children become very, very symbolic. And you know what? They love pretend toys. And if you go and look at Walmart in the toy section for your 2 to 5-year-olds, you're going to notice that it's trucks and airplanes and all kinds of activities where children can sort of pretend and be nurses and doctors and whatever. And so children become symbolic and are really interested in sort of manipulating symbols in their mind. You know what though? Children at this age aren't very logical. They're sort of intuitive, but not logic. So their thinking is intuitive and egocentric. So children can be fooled by very simple logic tasks. You give a kid a glass of water, 2 glasses of water that both have the same amount of water in them, same shaped glasses, same amount of water. And you can have the child look at them and decide that they have the same amount of water. You then take the glass, one of the glasses, and pour it into a tall, thinner glass so the water level rises, and you ask the child which glass has more water. The child saw you pour the same amount of water into a different shaped glass, but the child will look at the shape of the glass and say there's more water in the tall glass. So this child has demonstrated an inability to conserve a logical property. Now, there are lots of examples of presymbolic thinking. If you think about it, isn't Santa Claus the stupidest, most illogical story you could ever hear? This dude flies around the planet with a bunch of reindeer and delivers presents to everybody, or the Tooth Fairy, or the Easter Bunny, and yet children from the age of 2 to around 6 or 7 really believe in these illogical beliefs. So what Piaget realized is that after we evolve out of this pre-symbolic stage, our mind evolves into a stage where we are symbolic, but not very logical. If you go to your course resources folder, I have another video which demonstrates some 4-year-old and some 8-year-old children engaging in conservation tasks. That is, logical tasks that involve understanding that things don't change even though they may look a little different. And what you're going to find is the 4-year-olds fall for these conservation tasks. They're tricked by them, and the 8-year-olds aren't. And so what he suggested is we go through a second stage of cognitive development where we're symbolic but not logical. Now, in the third stage, which starts around the age of 6 or 7, kids are going to begin figuring out these conservation tasks. You're not going to fool them anymore. And what you'll notice is that children from around the age of 6 to about 11 move into a third stage where they're very logical. They love the rules of games. They love figuring out how things work. So children move into a third age we'll call the concrete operational period, where they're starting to get really good using their logic. Now, this is when children go to school, right? 5 to 6 years old, you go to kindergarten and first grade, and you start developing these logical abilities. And primary education is all about teaching children who have developed this new logical faculty to their thinking. They can now understand how things work together and things are organized. Now, I don't know if any of you are planning on being elementary school educators, but one of the things that you will have to know is that children during this stage are concrete and not abstract thinkers. So though children from 6 to 11 are really good logical thinkers, it's tough for them to grasp abstract concepts. So as a primary school teacher, you're going to want to have lots of hands-on activities where your kids can see what happens to a circle when you cut it in half, or can see different mathematical relationships using blocks, or make planets, or just do pictures. You want interactives, things that your kids can see and touch. Because kids at this age are very logical, but they're not great abstract thinkers. All right? Now, Piaget argued that starting around the age of 12 or so, we all start developing our ability to think about things in the abstract, to hold ideas like truth and beauty and justice and fairness in our mind, and to begin to think about these kinds of qualities and compare and contrast probable outcomes. So I could give you a situation and ask you to guess what might happen in the future, and you would be able to predict, based upon the situation, what's likely to happen. You might have what we call hypothetico-deductive reasoning. Anybody got a guess? I can tell you what happened. We broke a window and then we all ran, right? And see, an 11-year-old doesn't have what you might call hypothetico-deductive reasoning. And you as a parent have probably asked your child the question, well, didn't you think about what might happen? And your kid will look up at you with this blank stare. No, that's because they don't have this formal operational ability. Starting around the age of 12, 13, 14, you're going to be able to hypothesize and think abstractly about these things. And so Piaget argued that if you look at all minds, you can think of our minds as developing through these 4 distinct stages. In a sort of a general age range. So from the first couple of years of your life, it's very important that you give your child sensory toys so they can make things light up and turn and move, so they can see how they can manipulate the world. And then it's important to give your young children from the age of 2 to 6 lots of ways to pretend and engage in symbolic activities. But understand that they're not going to be so good necessarily at playing complex games, and they're not going to be so logical in their thinking. And then if you're an elementary school teacher, remember you have to have lots of hands-on activities for your concrete and logical thinking elementary school students. They're going to be able to think about things, but you're going to have manipulatives. You're going to have things for them to cut and paste and look at and make pictures of. And then right here in college right now, I'm trying to develop your formal operational or your abstract thinking abilities. Does anyone have any questions about that? Now, he argued, and if I still got everybody, I don't know how many people are still logged in. Oh, I've still got 11 of you. Okay. All right. So cool. Any questions? So you might say, well, what is this basic idea that people learn? And he argued that all knowledge is built on schemes, individual schemes that develop over the course of our life. And schemes start as simple as if you want to hold something, grab it, or if you want to see something, turn your head to look at it. These are the things that infants learn, and then these schemes evolve and become more complex over time. So, for example, he argues that we're all born with the sucking reflex, right? And it's just a reflex behavior. But over the first month of your life, when you engage in this reflex, you are fed and a feeling of hunger goes away. And so you begin to understand that sucking on things can feel good, right? So this is a scheme. Sucking on things can feel good. And so he argues that you take this scheme and you begin trying it in your world to see how it helps. And he argues that you might assimilate this scheme, learning that you can suck your thumb and that feels pretty good. You can suck a pacifier and that feels pretty good. But then he argues that you might use that scheme in a place where it doesn't work out in such a good way. You might pick up a pickle that your parent has and suck on that, and it tastes really sour and you don't like that. So you change that scheme and you say, you know what, I'll use it in these situations, but I won't use it in this situation. He argues these two processes are called assimilation and accommodation. And so he argues that every category, every piece of knowledge that we have starts from these very simple schemas, and we use these schemas. Hello, how you doing? Hi, folks. You know what? My wife Angela's here. She just took off because she's a little camera shy.
Sorry.
But he argues that we adjust these schemas through assimilation and accommodation. Okay. So, that's sort of a cognitive theory of development. Now, I've provided... Angela Madison Fitz says hello. Now, the thing is, Piaget thought our mind evolved through these 4 stages. And a lot of people argued that his stages were right in terms of the time, but that children could do things a lot earlier than he suggested. So there's a new branch of psychology, we'll call it cognitive development psychology. And basically what these people are doing is they are developing new theories based on these Piagetian stages and trying to explain and understand how the mind unfolds in these 4 stages. NC State, for example, has a great cognitive development psychology program for any of you who are interested in seeing how children's minds develop and at what time they develop logical abilities and concrete abilities and abstract abilities. Okay? Now, there's some, these limitations of object permanence, and then let's see, an inability to conserve. That's a limitation of pre-operational thinking. You know what, I cheated my lecture by talking about those before I got to this page. Okay. Erik Erikson. So I want to spend the next 10 minutes talking a little bit about the development of your identity. So how many of you are in a midlife crisis? How many of you are in a quarter life crisis? How many of you are still trying to figure out who you are as an individual? If any of you are having that question, if any of you wonder how you fit in the world, where you exist as a business person, where you exist as a love partner, as a family member, if you're wondering where you fit in, you are focused on the development of your ego or your identity. And you would be, you're doing what Erik Erikson would call ego psychology. And he argued they were all thoughtfully engaged in the process of developing our sense of identity. Now, Erik Erikson is a personality theorist that sort of grew up in the Freudian tradition, and he argued, Freud argued that our personality unfolded in 5 personality stages. And Erik Erikson took his theory, and we're not going to talk too much about Freud, we're going to talk about Erikson. And Erikson built a theory which explained how people's personality developed through 8 basic steps. All right, now Erik Erikson really thought the most important thing was that all of us, our entire life, are building this abstract sense of who we are. Think of it as an abstract thinking ability, kind of like Piaget's. Who am I? That's a very abstract question. I'm a psychologist. Well, you know what? That's an identity. It's not a physical part of me. I just went to school, somebody gave me a piece of paper, and the rest of you call me a psychologist. That's all I am. You're a father, a mother, a brother, a sister. You know what? That's not physically you. That's a relationship you have. So we are all working on this thing called an identity. And he argued that our identity unfolded through 8 stages, or 8, he called them crises, or psychosocial tasks. So basically, he argued that human beings, in developing our sense of self, we all have to answer 8 questions at very predictable times. And he argued that if, as we go through life, we meet people and have needs and questions that we have to answer at these predictable times. And if we do that, we develop 8 healthy personality traits that help us through life. And what I'd like to do today is to talk to you about how personality unfolds according to Erik Erikson. Now, why do you want to learn this particular theory? Turns out, as you get older, and I'm now on stage 6, it feels pretty right on. At each age group, you have different questions that you have to answer. Some of us answer them successfully, and some of us don't. And you can sort of tell when people sort of have difficulty at one stage because it snowballs and makes it difficult for them to develop in other ways. You might ask, why is a person unable to develop intimacy with other persons? Why is this person seem to bounce around and having difficulty creating an identity for themselves? You might ask a person, why are they so self-focused and self-involved in work that they really don't care about any other person around them? We can sort of ask these questions and start to understand them based upon the fact that all of us have 8 sort of questions to answer, and we can either answer these in a successful or in an unsuccessful manner. Successful resolution of each stage leads to a virtue, or don't think of it as a virtue that sort of has a value-laden judgment. It's more of a strength, an ego strength, if you will. Now, developmental psychologist. It's useful for you understanding how your personality developing. And one of the things that I think it is important for teachers and for nurses and anybody that has to interact with people who may be having challenges in their life, it helps you to understand who's most important in that person's life and what sort of major task or questions are they probably asking in their life. You know what? You're right. I forgot. God, I'm older, KB. I'm in stage 7 as well. Oops. Yeah, I've just made the transition the last couple of years. Crap. I am getting old. So here's the thing. I've broken these 8 stages up into sort of 3 slides in a semi-arbitrary way because I think it sort of helps me understand how the personality develops. In infancy, before you have a sense of self, you're developing what I might call the subjective self. That's the self that is afraid of certain things. That's the self that hates certain things. That's the self that loves certain things. If you think about it, that self you're not really aware of, but it motivates you, right? You don't know why you're afraid or why you fear things, but you have these motivations that drive you. Let's call that the subjective self, the self that feels, not the self you know, but the self that feels. During the first year of your life, you are an infant, an incredibly helpless infant, and you have nothing but a relationship with one person, your primary caregiver. And during that age, you have to learn whether or not the world is a place you can trust or a world that is full of fear and horror for you. So are you going to develop a sense of trust? Is your primary caregiver going to take care of you, soothe you when you cry, feed you when you're hungry, change you when you're wet? If they do, you may develop a belief that the world is a good place and you may develop a sense of hope. On the other hand, if your first year is horrible, if you don't get this kind of feeling, you may begin to fear the world and reject the world because you realize it's not a place that's going to make you feel good. So he argues that during the first year of your life, your most primary relationship is with your primary caregiver, like attachment theory yesterday. But he argues that you're developing, he would answer the question, what are you learning during that first year? He would argue you're learning that the world is going to be a good place. And that's a model that you take with you as you move through the rest of your life. Now, during your early childhood, your early and middle childhood, you're developing what I would call your objective concrete self. Remember, Piaget talked about children being symbolic and concrete. This is that part of yourself that depends on who you are. How competent are you? How smart are you? How creative are you? How much do people like you? These are all ways in which you think about yourself, right? But they relate to just you. They're your concrete sense of self. I would argue that stage 2, 3, and 4 are when we develop that concrete sense of self. Now, if you have a good sense of trust underneath, it's easier for you to achieve the virtues in these 3 psychosocial tasks. If you haven't developed a sense of basic trust, it's going to be very difficult for you to develop autonomy, initiative, and industry. Do you understand how these build upon one another? Now, he argued from the age of 2 to 3, a child is learning how to walk and talk. A child is learning how to initiate things, to do things, to explore their world. And it's really easy as a parent to stop your kid from doing anything that you don't exactly understand. But you know what? Sometimes your kid might want to roll over on your head. Sometimes your kid might want to stick their nose in a flower. You know what I mean? So we kind of have to give kids a chance to sort of try stuff out, but at the same time, we can't let them do everything. We have to put limits on them. So from the age of 2 to 3, your child is learning, you know what, should I feel ashamed of trying anything, or should I feel sort of a sense of confidence, if you will. And he argues that during this time you're dealing with your parents, and your parents really can be overprotective or underprotective during this time. But if you resolve this stage, you develop what you might call a sense of willpower. How many of you say, God, I can't do anything. I don't have the ability. You have no internal power. This is that willpower. He would argue you develop your willpower right during this second age where your parents say, no, you can't do that, and make you feel bad about doing things or wanting things. So he argues that this is when you develop willpower. Now, at around age 3 or 4, you're starting to interact with your larger family. And you know what? It's time to play games. It's time to eat food. It's time to help put away the clothes or to try to do things. And at around the 4 and 5-year-old kid is going to love to be helpful around the house because they want to feel like they've got plans, like they can initiate and do things. Now, your 4-year-old's going to screw things up for sure, right? But the thing is, you've got to give them a chance to do things. And if you make your kid feel bad about trying new things out and making mistakes and not being perfect, they may develop a sense of fearfulness and a lack of desire to initiate something. On the other hand, if you let your kid fold the clothes, even if they screw the clothes up, they'll develop a sense of initiative, a sense of having plans. Hey, I'm going to help mommy do this and this and this. And he argues that if you give your kid a sense of initiative, that they'll develop what he calls purpose, which is the ability to have a plan. Some people, just float around and they can't see themselves going to college and getting a degree. You folks have a sense of purpose. That's why you're in school. People with inertia sometimes can't do that. Now, he argues that when around 7 or 8, we all go to school. And that's when we learn the difference between something well done and something poorly done. Your teacher gives you a satisfactory or an unsatisfactory. You play sports and you learn that sometimes you win and sometimes you get a participation trophy. Now, during this age, children need to learn how to be good at something, and more importantly, they also need to learn how to do something that they're not necessarily good at. If you just put stuff in front of your kid that they're good at and have them focus on that and get perfect at that, you know what? That's great, but they'll develop what we might call narrow virtuosity and an inability to try something new. Each and every one of us has to learn how to try something that you suck at, right? You have to learn how to do something and be good, but you also have to learn to be confident dealing with initial failures. If you overcome this stage, you develop the feeling of competence, which is a good sense of efficacy or self-esteem in yourself. Think about this. I have willpower, I have a sense of purpose, and I have competence. All of this built on a sense of hope leads you to this third stage of personality where you're trying to develop this abstract notion of who I am. 9-year-olds don't think about who they are. 14-year-olds do nothing but think about who they are. 45-year-olds do nothing but think about who they are. This is what we might call the abstract sense of self, your identity. And sometimes people go through identity crises, which is where they question the self that they've built up in their mind. Now, 4 stages. Identity versus role confusion. Teenagers trying to figure out who you are sexually, who you are professionally, who you are as a music, what you dress like. How many of you had bad haircuts or wore terrible outfits in high school? How many of you were anarchists for a week and then communists for another week and then capitalists for a third week? We were all trying on different identities, trying to figure out who we were. That's why some of us got pink hair or red hair. Some of us got piercings. We're trying to figure out who we are. This is when you're going through the stage of identity versus role confusion. You know what? Some people are afraid to pick an identity and they just decide to never grow up, sort of the eternal Peter Pans. These are people who've developed role confusion. On the other hand, you and I all have a sense of who we are as an adult. I'm a college professor, you're a college student, so we all have an identity. And he argues that the virtue of this is fidelity, which is a belief in the system and yourself. I believe in the system because I'm a psychologist and I fit in that system. So he argues that fidelity. And some people feel alienated from society. Society's stupid. I just don't get it. Those people haven't developed a sense of fidelity, if you will. You got to buy into the system if you're going to pick an identity. Now, in your 20s and 30s, and you know what? Most people during this stage don't want to settle down because they're afraid of losing themselves if they have a partner. They're totally afraid that they'll be overwhelmed by a romantic partner. But you know what? As you move into your 20s, mid to late 20s, and you feel more confident about who you are, we all then try to bond with another person. Could be a romantic relationship, could be a best friend and roommate, a friend for life, could be heterosexual, could be homosexual, could be anything. But we're all trying to build a group of friends, a cohort. You know what I mean? The people that support you, that love you, that make you feel good. This is what we would call the intimacy versus isolation stage. How many of you are questioning your friends or your loved ones and trying to ask the question, can I build a sense of love, or am I unlovable? Some people don't feel good about themselves in love. Some people think they don't want it. But we all need this bond. If you resolve this crisis, you find love. So we have a sense of belief in society called fidelity, and we have a sense of care for another person we'll call love. Now, in my age, in KB's age, man, me and him are close to the finish line. You know what I mean? I can see that I'm not dead yet, but I've started thinking about funeral arrangements, right? I've got insurance. I know that eventually it will happen, right? And so now I'm trying to think about my family and how can I extend myself by making my family secure. So I know that life goes on past me. So I want to set up, if you will, some sort of something, a namesake, something that carries my tradition on. I want to make the people around me better. You know, I'm going to save up money so my kids have money. I want them to go to college and become great students. So now I'm trying to generate something outside of myself. Now, some people are totally self-focused. I don't want family. I don't want love. I just want to be me and drive my Porsche and have my fancy car. These people are stagnated and sometimes empty because we all need to care for something larger than ourselves. On the other hand, you might be that housewife or house husband that has no career and your life is totally about your family and doctor's appointments and taking care of the house and the grocery list and the husband and everybody else, and you lose your sense of self and you might actually become overextended. So you want to find a balance between yourself and between caring about your family around you. And if you do, you develop this virtue we'll call care. And then he argues, when you meet patients at the end of their life, when you talk to your grandparents, you notice that all they want to do is talk about their life and what they did and what they thought and what they felt. This is because we're reviewing our life, and I'm trying to figure out, did I do it right? Did I spend my time and money wisely? Did I waste my love? And he argues that during this stage, we think about the larger aspects of life. Man, I'm getting ready to die. So really, truth and beauty and fairness and the world being a good place really is important to me. And how did I do that? Was I a force for good or a force for evil? He argues we go through this integrity versus despair crisis. And hopefully you can look back on your life and feel good about the things you did. And if you do, you may develop a bit of wisdom, a bit of understanding that prepares you for death. Oh my goodness, I am so sorry I took 38 minutes. But what I wanted you to understand was how these two theories provide a broad portrait, if you will, for how people move through the stages of life. And what I want you to do is to notice two things. They both used a lot of descriptive methods. Piaget did do some experimental methods, but Erikson did mostly surveys and interviews with people at different ages of life in different settings. And they found that the human mind and personality seems to move through these four stages, from pre-aware, trust versus mistrust, or the sensory motor period, to sort of these concrete thinking about developing logical abilities, to thinking about the self logically and developing competencies. And then the self and the personality move into cognition, or your mental abilities, and your personality moves into what we might call an abstract stage. Do you have any questions or understand what I was trying to say today? I wish I could look at you in the face because I feel like I probably lost you. Now, here's the thing. If you have any questions, or want to elucidate on my confusing lecture, or the book doesn't help you out, there are 2 short videos that are, I think, 5 to 6 minutes each, which are basically redundancies of my lecture, but put together with my lecture, with these with the book, and with these short videos, you should be able to understand Piaget and Erikson theories. Now, this week's Kahoot quiz is going to be about Erikson and Piaget's theory to kind of help you practice for the test. Do you have any questions for me so far? Are there any questions I can answer? Any comments? Are any of you in a quarter-life crisis? If you want to send me an email and tell me about your quarter-life or your midlife crisis, I'll be more than happy to tell you about my midlife crisis too. Okay? Well, I don't really have anything else to say. We'll be lecturing tomorrow morning. How specific should our memorizing Piaget and Erikson be? You know what, KB? That is a great, great question. Ken wants to know, how specific should you be? Really, I focus on trust and mistrust, identity stage, generativity, and stage 5 through 8. I usually do not ask about stages 2, 3, and 4. And really what I want you to know is the broad crisis. I'm not even going to ask you about the virtue. That's a good question, Ken. But I do want you to know the broad crises, and that's what the Kahoot quiz will be about. And with Piaget, you know what, I don't like the way I ordered my slides, and I don't think I did a great job. But I want you to know the 4 stages of the mind: presymbolic, symbolic but not logical, symbolic, logical and concrete, logical and abstract. And then I want you to know the limitations: no object permanence, no conservation, and no hypothetical deductive reasoning. So just the broad swaths of the theories, if you will. That's a great question. Any other questions? All right. I'll be here at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. We're going to be talking about sensation and perception, and I will be talking about how vision works, how our eyes generate color, black and white vision, and the difference in how visual illusions work. Madison Fitz has a quick question. I'm pretty sure I'm in a quarter-life crisis right now. It's very interesting to learn about. Thank you for the great lecture. You know what? I hope you spend some time thinking about who you are and try to figure it out, Madison. I think we're all in crisis mode, right? KB Oil. All right, fantastic. Take care, and I'll see you tomorrow, okay? Bye.
Your call cannot be completed as dialed. Please consult your directory and call again, or ask your operator for assistance. This is a recording.